Someone recently asked if I could make a video on how to shut down the inner critic, to shut down those self-hating voices that we so often have inside of our head. And I was thinking about it and wondering how would someone else answer that question? Would they have certain techniques for shutting down the inner critic and making it go away and neutralizing it? And I really don't know. What I think is I've never been able to actually shut down the inner critic. I think even that language, it's not what I've done at all. But I've definitely had an evolving relationship with my inner critic, with that self-hating voice inside of my head, those self-hating voices. And I'd like to talk about how I deal with my inner critic and those self-hating voices. Came up most recently when I made a video on mild sexual abuse of daughters by fathers. Oh, my inner critic came up. Your video stunk. It was no good. You're generalizing. You're projecting your own stuff onto other people, your own fears about shitty parents and things like this. And you're over-dramatizing the situation. You're making a mountain out of a molehill. It's not this common. Blah, 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 blah. You didn't say it well enough. Your examples are blah, really, and also all these words going on with a lot of anxiety. Me just going, and not being able to focus on other things, and, really a lot of stress. And this was an example of something that I've gone through a lot in my life. And it wasn't a question of shutting down those voices. For me, when this happened, when I made this video, and also what I've learned throughout my life that's really worked for me is, first of all, taking a step away from this dynamic in my head, this self-critical dynamic, and saying, what's going on here? Where is this coming from? And in a way, analyzing it. And for me, again and again and again, to see that those self-hating and self-critical voices are the implanted voices of the sides of my parents that hated the true me. The sides of them that were threatened by the healthiest sides of me. And I took in those sides of my parents. In a way, I became my own worst enemy. And I did it for a very good reason as a child, because my parents despised me for being really alive, being really curious, being really growing and evolving and bright and special even. It really threatened them. It threatened their hurt, shut down, traumatized sides. And they loved me less because I threatened them so much. They even openly hated me. The part of them that loved me less. The part of them that hated me more. And that was unbearable for me. That was a death sentence for me. So what I did is I used an unconscious strategy that children use. I took those parts of my parents, I brought them into myself, and I made myself the gatekeeper against myself. I made myself the one who attacked myself in a way to stop them from hating me. I, in a way, took control of the situation. It was less painful for me to criticize and hate myself, to beat myself down, than to have them do it. Maybe I was more gentle. In a way, maybe my self-hating voices, maybe the rejection was less painful. Maybe I felt safer because I could control it. Also, they gave me a lot of approval for hating myself and criticizing myself. Basically, that question, how do you shut down the inner critic? It wasn't that for me as a child. It was, how do I shut down myself? And that's what my self-critical voices did. They shut down me so that the true, bright, curious me never fully came out. And it allowed me to be more palatable to my parents, to my family system, to the world in general. And Therefore, I survived. I got some more crumbs of love, and they didn't reject me outright and fully. I didn't die. The problem is, as I grew up, those self-critical, self-hating voices stayed. Those sides of my parents stayed. This became, so sad to say, a part of my personality. It became who I was, to the point that I didn't even know that those self-hating, self-critical voices were anything other than me. I knew that I hated myself in a lot of ways. I knew that I despised myself in a lot of ways. I knew that I didn't really have self-esteem. I knew that I was terribly insecure. I also knew that there were parts of me in my own private world away from everyone where I could be me, I could be curious, I could be vulnerable and spontaneous and honest. But all those parts of me, those self-hating critical voices, made sure that those parts stayed very split off and private. And in the more public sphere, I was much more quiet, much more shut down and lost and confused, and that felt more safe to me. Well, then came my rebellion. Rebellion against these voices, my desperate urge to become real and true, to let this vulnerable, honest, lovely side of me, this true child side of me that had gotten stopped and stunted, to let him come out and be real. This happened starting when I was 20. And, the self-hating voices came out so loud. And a lot of the world echoed those voices and said those voices are correct. And because a lot of people, even friends of mine, certainly my family still, my parents still now, late 40s and their 50s, they despised me for becoming more real. I threatened them again. Professors didn't like me. It was terrifying. And yet, I kept doing it anyway, because there was some part of me deep down that knew that the real me was more important and more powerful and more honest and more healthy than those self-hating voices. And so there was a war inside of myself that was on. And I tried to make those self-hating voices go away. Drugs, alcohol, romance, workaholism, dissociation, sports, anything I could do, make those voices go away. And none of it worked. None of that worked. None of the distractions worked. But then I simultaneously was doing other things that were working. And that was working to understand myself better. And primarily it was through journaling. But also I was writing really self-reflective songs, doing a lot of meditation, doing a lot of walking, being alone, a lot going out in the forest and being with nature and just reflecting on my life, analyzing my childhood history, noticing the parallels, beginning to notice the parallels between these self-hating voices and the voices of my parents, really making sense of where they came from, the roots of them. It was slow. It was a long, slow process. I'd figure out parts, and parts of me were still profoundly in denial. But then what I started figuring out was the thing that gave me the most satisfaction was grieving. That sense of realizing at a deep, profound level and feeling it, that I'd lost something. Something was stolen from me. And that something was starting to come back. And the grief process was helping me bring it back. And the more that I grieved, the grieving especially, the grieving, that neutralized those self-critical, self-hating voices, those voices that despised the true me. Because when I was grieving, the whole process of grieving was an expression of empowerment of my true self. My true self was bursting forth and coming back to life and overtaking all these colonized parts of my personality. And the colonized parts of my personality were the parts that had those self-hating voices. My parents, my traumatizers, had colonized whole parts of me, laid waste to it, ruined it, cut down all the forests of the true me. And the grieving was fertilizing the forests again, and it was starting to grow. But it wasn't like, it happened and then it was done and then I could move forward and I had no more self-hating, self-critical voices. It wasn't that way at all. Because my inner self was huge. There was a lot of terrain. Grieving was big in a way, but it was also like I didn't grieve constantly, and I also was living in the world of people who reflected the behavior and thought patterns and traumatizing nature of my parents. And also there was a lot of me that was very wounded, so my grief process often only touched little parts of me here and there. So that's why it's gone on for decades and it's still ongoing, and why there's still parts of me that have self-hating, self-critical voices. And also, I think, how can I not have self-hating and self-critical voices when we live in a world that is so screwed up, so in denial, so traumatizing? When we look at the future, when I look at the future and say, what's going to happen? It's not nice what's going on. And this world reflects the worst sides of my parents, this ugly world, the ugly sides of the world. And my parents like this world. And it's not a world for the beautiful true self that is me, the beautiful true self that is everyone. It's a world that's quite rejecting in a lot of ways of these beautiful and true and vulnerable sides of me and of everyone. And so I am criticized by the world, by these unhealthy sides of the world. The healthy sides of me are still criticized, and it reflects the little implanted sides of me that I haven't gotten rid of yet. And so I don't know how to shut down all of the self-hating, self-critical voices. But I do have ways in my life to make sense of it, to understand what's going on, to put things in perspective, and to work so hard to love myself. So let me talk about some of those things very, very quickly. And I've talked about it many, many times. Oh, if I'm having really horrible self-critical voices that are nasty, and I have some inkling that this is not correct, what this is saying, this is trying to kill me and shut me down, write about it in my journal. Meditate on it. Take a walk and think about it. Talk with a friend, if I can find a friend who is mature and who has insight. Do some self-therapy. Give myself a nice warm shower. Have a nice meal. Play some music. Relax. All sorts of these things can really be helpful. Look at my dreams. Analyze my dreams. Do something productive, like make a video where I talk about this. I can also read my old journals. Look at the old patterns and see how I processed these old things in my life and how I made it to a healthier place again and again. So basically I can have continuity with my historical grieving process and bring it right up to the present. And in my lucky days, in my lucky moments, sometimes the wave of my grief process comes and it washes away all those self-critical voices and reminds me, oh, Daniel, yes, you're on the right path. And that feeling of being self-connected, self-loving, not self-hating, it lasts a while sometimes, but inevitably, if I keep growing, I know that those self-critical voices will come back, and I, yet again, will have to engage more consciously and in a more focused way in my healing process and keep moving forward toward more grieving.